Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Project Management Information Session. We're so glad that you've decided to join us today to learn more about the project management classes that we have to offer at LFCC Workforce Solutions. If you look on your screen straight ahead, you'll notice to the right, we have some project management classes, which we'll get into in a lot more detail later. I just want to make sure that you can orient yourself to the screen and see what we've got going. Real quick, a little bit about LFCC. Lord Fairfax Community College, soon to be named Laurel Ridge Community College, serves approximately 20,000 students a year. Our department, Workforce Solutions, serves about half of that number of students. Plus, we serve over 1,000 employers per year. Our department, Workforce Solutions, is part of the overall mission of the college to prepare students for credentials to careers in our local region. We offer 3 types of programs to start, enhance, or change your trajectory for your career. What I mean by starting your career, we have a lot of students that come to us to get an initial certification in fields like HVAC, electrical, plumbing, CDL, medical assisting, pharmacy technician, phlebotomy, a multitude of IT careers, etc. And then we have students that come to us to enhance their skills, to tap into our ongoing continuing education courses. For example, I mentioned IT. We offer all of the CompTIA A+ security network certifications. We also offer the PMP CAPM certifications, which I'm assuming you're interested in if you're joining us today for this particular info session. We also offer classes in the change category. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of folks in our region that are underemployed. They're working below their potential. They're coming to us to upskill so that they can get a better job or get a better job within the organization they're already working at. For example, with the project management certification, you can look at gaining a salary increase by just having that certification. And we'll get into those details in a minute. If you look at your screen, over to the right there, we've got our project management page in our catalog, which you can access by going to lfccworkforce.com. And on that page, page 25, you'll see that we have a 4-part series in project management. It breaks out 4 of the key processes, from stakeholder management to project schedules, to plan project management, the plan itself, and then risk management. You can bundle and save by taking registering for all those courses at once. You'll see the bundle price here at the bottom of the page. Or you can take them a la carte, meaning one at a time, whatever suits your schedule. Those classes begin in January. So actually next week, they already start. And then we also have right here in the middle of the screen, the project management professional, PMP, certified associate in project management CAPM exam prep. That particular course covers the content to prepare you to take that exam for that certification. It covers both of those certifications just by taking that course. What I'm going to do next is introduce you to our instructor, Chris Grassmonk. He is a fabulous instructor who gets the highest ratings possible for his courses, time and time again, has been teaching for us many, many years, and has an extensive, very impressive background in project management. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to further introduce himself and explain a little bit more in detail about the programs that we offer. Thank you.
Sounds good, Becky. Thank you. Let me bring up my screen.
Okay, let me stop sharing. There you go.
And let me know if you can see.
I can see it.
Awesome. Great. So I've just got a couple slides here. Typically like to have this conversational, but all dependent on who joins us this afternoon. Anyway, this is the project management information session for January 10th. And real quick on who I am, I'm Chris Grassmuck. I have my PMP certification since 2012. I'm also a certified Scrum Master, Safe Agilist, as well as an IC Agilist. Those last three are some of the more common Agile certifications that you may find out there in industry, but it does not preclude the importance or take away from the importance of the PMI PMP certification or the PMI CAPM certification. I do have a day job outside of instructing. I worked for Trillion Technologies for the last two and a half years. Prior to that, I was with IBM for about 7.5 years. I've spent 8 years leading or co-chairing the local PMI WDC chapter out here in the Shenandoah Valley, which is the Shenandoah Valley community of PMI WDC. We meet probably once every other month. During COVID times, it's been probably once a quarter virtually, and that's just allows us project managers and those pursuing their certifications to get together, achieve our continuing education credits, and kind of share ideas and hear local speakers. As Becky mentioned, I've been a trainer or an instructor at Lord Fairfax Workforce Solutions for about 4 years, doing what I love, talking about project management and all things surrounding the exam prep courses that we have here. I'm also, I call myself a project management evangelist because it is one of my favorite topics to discuss, whether it's during work hours or after work hours. I'm a father of 2. I have a graduating senior this year, as well as a 5th grader. I'm also spend time mentoring and coaching on things like project management, entrepreneurship, and all things business related. I'm also a local and quote international speaker. I did have an opportunity recently to share the stage, so to speak, or assist in a breakout session talking about project management with Damon Johns, as well as provide some training at some of our local organizations such as White House Fruits, American Woodmark, and such. Internationally, I had an opportunity with IBM to actually speak at one of the international project management chapters over in Slovenia. So my claim to fame is I'm an international speaker. So jumping over here to why project management? It's a fairly obvious to me why project management is exciting and necessary in industry today. But oftentimes, those outside of industry or outside of project management have questions of, okay, why do we need a project manager? I have a manager or leader or functional lead that tells me what to do on a day in, day out basis, but oftentimes organizations take on projects, and it can be a multitude of reasons. It can be, to lead an organizational change, develop or drive a unique product, respond to customer requirements. Again, it could be to develop, a new product. A couple of years ago, probably a little over a decade ago, Apple came out with the iPhone. At one time, that was a project until it became, operational, and additional projects have since spun off from that. When we're looking to update, from the iPhone 12 up to the iPhone 13, that's a project in itself. So the slide I have up here is presenting, what effective project management helps to do, and that's, as I mentioned, helping meet an organization's business objectives. What is the reason that an organization exists? Is it to develop new technologies, new products, or is it to solve an organizational need? Hey, we're looking to change the way we do customer service from one way into another. That would be a reason for an organization to take on a project. Or for example, Lord Fairfax Workforce Solutions is looking to add a new class. Well, that would be a project for for a time until they roll that out to production, roll that out to a class. And so, other reasons are to satisfy stakeholders, help an organization and projects identify and respond to risks. And you'll hear, if you do decide to take one of the classes, specifically the risk class, you'll hear that that's what project managers spend most of their time on. That's what I spend most of my time on in a day, is not only addressing the current risks that we do have in our risk register, but also looking out over the horizon to figure out what other risks do we have coming up that may impact the success of our project. Of course, one of the things that I like about project management is I'm able to play many roles on any given day, or from one day to the next. It can switch. From one day I'm the CEO or the CFO of my project itself, worrying about the financial constraints of the project, and the next day I could be a cheerleader, making sure that the needs are met on my project team, making sure that if I have a technical resource and their child is sick and that that's impacting their work, or just in general humanity sakes, checking on them and making sure that they're happy, making sure that the job is satisfying them, making sure that their family is doing okay. And so that's one of the exciting intricacies of project management that I do enjoy. Addressing problems and issues. If you like to be a problem solver, if you like to be that person who if they don't know the answer, they can go and get the answer. That's what project management is. It's you don't have to have the technical knowledge to execute a technical project. You just need to know where those resources are, manage those problems into solutions. Last couple bullets there, last two bullets there on the left side is manage change. I kind of already discussed that, but a misconception of a project, misconception of a successful project is you get your budget, you get your period of performance, and you go off and you execute. And if you deliver on time and deliver under budget, then great, you get a pat on the back. But the misnomer is that projects do change. The expectation oftentimes is they don't change, but I can't tell you a time in my career and many other project managers' careers where the projects that they are managing don't change. So we have to, as project managers, set up the process within the project itself on how that's going to change, and make sure that the customer and stakeholders understand that, as well as our project team to execute on that. And then finally, there's of course control costs, and I kind of already hit on that. We're not successful as a project or project managers unless we're making sure that we come in on budget. And if there is an impact to the budget, then why is that happening? What is the reason for that? And how are we going to address that? Do our stakeholders have additional room to increase the budget, or sometimes even de-scope the project and of course decrease the budget accordingly? And then over the right, poorly managed projects are just the opposite of the effective. You end up with cost overruns, you end up with poor quality, you end up having to do rework, which impacts your costs. So this is the whole reason there is a project management industry and career path is to make sure that organizations out there don't run into these issues, or at least mitigate these issues that may pop up. And I'll pause there just real quick, Becky. I don't know if anybody's joined or has any questions, but I'll try and pause occasionally.
No questions so
Okay.
far.
All right, sounds good. So in the classes that I teach, you'll see me pop up this triangle on the board, and of course ask the class what does this mean to them. Of course, after the first class, not 99% of the time the students understand what this is, but this is what project managers call the triple constraint, or the iron triangle, or the golden triangle. So this is how project managers base their success or are deemed successful on a project. So you've probably heard of this if you've taken any business classes, but one of the constraints is, of course, time or schedule, right? And so if this increases, of course, most of the times another leg of the triangle is going to change as well. For example, cost, right? If you increase your schedule, you're most likely going to increase your cost because you're going to have to increase your resources, and vice versa. If things, if you reduce your time, ideally you should be able to reduce your budget as well. And then the third leg of the triangle is, of course, scope. So that's what you're looking to deliver to the customer. And of course, if you manage all these legs to the triangle as you planned, and as you've developed and worked your way through that plan, of course, again, you're successful. There's one final piece of this triangle that I add in there, and it's really the fourth constraint, and that's the quality piece. And the quality is really what ties all three of these legs of the triangle together. And so if you're not delivering a quality project to the customer, then these other three constraints aren't of value to them, or a lower value to the customer key stakeholders that you do that. And just moving over to the next slide here, talk about where project managers add value, right? And so you see, you see kind of these four constraints again, right? These are tied into that previous slide, right? Your customer satisfaction is your scope, and your timeliness, of course, is your schedule. And then a budget compliance is your cost, and then finally constrained all by the quality, right? And so that kind of flows into project success. And so where does the project manager add the value? Is we add our value with making sure that we are customer focused, right? And so oftentimes our project teams can get focused on their daily task. What do I have lined up for the next 8 hours? And then the following day, what do I have lined up for those 8 hours? It's our job as project managers, and that's kind of what I teach in these various courses, is to make sure that we keep focused on our customers, focused on our stakeholders. And then, along with that, making sure that we're developing great teams. Oftentimes we don't have an opportunity to choose who our project team members are going to be. They're oftentimes assigned to us in what I call real world project management. So you have to deal with the hand that you're dealt. And so you as a project manager have to use the tools and techniques that you've gained through your experience in industry, as well as courses like we teach here at Lord Fairfax around project management and developing those great teams. And so PMI has focused on that, and that in our PMP and CAPM training, as well as the exam tests on that, to make sure that we do have those soft skills. And then finally, making sure that we have the capability and the ability to delegate. A project manager can't do it alone. Imagine the project or program manager responsible for, the space shuttle, or the various rockets that Tesla and Jeff Bezos are sending. Those require multiple project and program managers, but they're not doing that work alone. They have a huge team that they have to lead and direct, and that's again goes back up to point 2, where you have to make sure that you're developing great teams. And of course, delegating and managing great teams leads to that fourth point, is making sure that you're challenging and leading your team, right? Of course, that if you're challenging your team to develop as they said they would, and deliver as they said they would, then you're challenging them, and you're allowing them to take on leadership positions and build their capabilities, and ultimately that leads to key growth and development within your organization. And as I mentioned earlier on those slides, I spend most of my time identifying and controlling risks, right? When we do see risks, we have to determine what the probability of impact is, and then what level of impact on the project could that risk have. And so we do a lot of that analysis, and then I'm presenting it to our key stakeholders, whether that be an external stakeholder or external customer, or it could be internal within your organization itself. And then finally, again, what do project managers have to do? They have to deliver, right? And our project team's success, and ultimately our organizational success as a company, is based on our ability to deliver. So as a project manager, that is our key component, key contribution to an organization and our success. And of course, all those 6 points ultimately flow into, the right deliverables at the right cost at the right time. Again, back to those triple constraints leading to customer satisfaction. And that's again what I teach through these courses, whether it be the 4 project management knowledge area or process group classes, or ultimately the PMP and CAPM exam prep classes. And then finally, just kind of, again, why project management? What benefits does it bring to an organization and or yourself? I'll jump over here, and this is really in the upper right hand corner there. What I really focus on, or it tempts folks who are taking the class or interested in the certification. There's typically about a 20 to 25% difference between the pay scale or pay rate of a non-certified project manager compared to a certified project manager. And this is, of course, pulled from the PMI Pulse of the profession, but the median salary, as it says there, for PMP holders in the United States is about 25% higher than those not holding that PMP certification. And then the rest of the slide here just highlights, organizations that adopt project management practices demonstrate overall higher performance, as you can imagine, and as expressed in the previous slides, right? So if do they meet the original goals or intent or business intent of the project? And as it says there, the PM leaders, those who have certified project management professionals, those who are following the tenets of project management, are 76%, or those projects are meeting it 76% of the time compared to 61% of the time. Are they completed on time? That last one there, 61% of the time they are, versus 41%, less than half of the projects not following the tenets of PMI, PMP are meeting or achieving delivery on time. So that just drives why we need more certified project managers in our various organizations, is to make sure that we can deliver on these triple constraints. And then finally, down there at the bottom, leading organizations demonstrate higher commitment to PM training and PM process improvements. Again, 80%. If you're these program leader organizations, 80% are providing that ongoing project management training. That's one of the reasons why I help lead that Shenandoah Valley community, is to make sure that we have opportunities like the ones presented at Lord Fairfax to continue those continuing education credits required for a lot of our organizations, and of course required for maintaining our PMP certification, our CAPM certification. Any questions out there?
No questions right now.
All right, sounds good. So I'll just jump into some of the classes that Becky mentioned. Coming up, as she mentioned, we've got the 4 key processes to delivering success. Those start actually, like she said, next week, next Wednesday specifically, and then they follow on every other week. So we have the stakeholder management, and then we have the project schedule, project scheduling, which is the 6 steps to project schedules. Also have project management planning, and that's actually developing a plan and then making sure that you have the ability to work that plan. And then finally, we wrap up with risk management. As Becky mentioned, they can be taken as a group or as a package, or they can be taken a la carte. They do somewhat build on each other, but they're not required. I typically, at the beginning of class, kind of ramp up as we start building a project and talking about the various components of a project as it relates to the titles of the classes. I do take a step back and kind of bring everybody back up to speed. And again, those classes happen every other week. And then the big course, the PMP CAPM exam prep class, starts in April. It goes for 9 weeks. I believe there's 1 break in there for a holiday. I believe it may fall over Memorial Day. And then we cover back in 2020, the PMP exam changed, and it went from very process group and knowledge area heavy, where we discussed and trained on the 49 processes. It has since switched to more of a people, process, and business. And that includes not only the predictive or waterfall methodologies, but we also talk about the agile and hybrid methodologies. So you do get a flavor of both of those within this course. And of course, you know, when you do go on to take the exam and become a certified project management professional, you're actually tested on both of those methodologies. And again, you know, the people piece is emphasizing the soft skills that I kind of mentioned on some of the previous slides, to make sure that you're able to effectively lead a project, making sure you're able to address your project team's needs and your other external stakeholders' needs. As well as we still talk about the processes, making sure that you as a project manager, you as an exam test taker or exam taker, understand the technical aspects of making sure that you're able to successfully manage a project. So, you know, I mentioned the 49 processes that PMI used to test on. Those are still woven in to this class, as well as to the exam. And then finally, the third component there is the business environment, which is just highlighting the connection, as I mentioned, between projects and organizations and organizational strategy there too. And so the key difference between, you know, these two sets of classes is the project management series itself is much more of a real life based. We you know, at the start of the class, the first class that we have is the stakeholder management. We sit and figure out what project do we want to take on, and we kind of weave that that methodology throughout the next, you know, throughout those 4 classes that we have. And again, if you do decide to skip a class, then, you know, we make sure to bring you up to speed and make sure that you understand the project that we're taking on. But it kind of weaves, you know, a commonality, a common goal throughout those projects. And then, you know, the difference is that is, again, the real life project management. And then we bring in, you know, the PMP CAPM. We're much more focused on making sure you understand the terminology, make sure you understand the objectives and tools and techniques that fall into or that are tested by PMI for the exam. So it's much more structured, much more focused on what you need to know, again, to pass the exam. So diving into a little bit of details on these various classes, again, we've got the stakeholder management class, which is where, you know, we learn to identify, prioritize, and understand your stakeholders for project success. As it says there, no project is an island, right? It has impact on or is impacted by stakeholders. And who is a stakeholder? Stakeholders, again, anybody who has impact to the project and who could be impacted by the project. So, you know, a lot of times I surprise a student by reminding them that folks within the organization, in fact, folks within the project team themselves are stakeholders. So you as a project manager have to be aware of the needs of both the external stakeholders as well as the external or project team members to make sure that you can, you know, achieve success on your project. So it's about knowing who those stakeholders are, how to manage their involvement, and also set their expectations. So we walk through that over 2.5 hours on the 19th, and helping you better engage your stakeholders for success. And then 2 weeks after that, we dive into 6 steps to project scheduling. This is pulled out of the PMI's PMBOK, the 6th edition, and it's about what I call the baby steps of developing a project. Oftentimes, you know, in real world project management, we sit down in front of Microsoft Project or some other project tool, to include Excel, and we start, you know, drafting up a project schedule all on our own. The key takeaway here is we should not be doing project schedules alone. We should be involving our project team, our subject matter experts, in helping develop that project. So as it says there, in this course, you'll understand how to plan your project schedule, right? Everything we do as a project manager starts with a plan, right? And then we determine what actions or what steps need to be taken to accomplish and establish a particular order of those activities, and then what's the duration of those activities, so we can build out our schedule, so that we can take those components of a project schedule, give them off to the people who are going to execute those steps, and so that they can go off and perform those steps, perform those activities with as little oversight as possible, or flip side, just enough oversight by a project manager to achieve success. And that course there is on February 2nd. And then the next course 2 weeks later on the 16th is the project management plan, right? Plan the work, work the plan. So this is PMI believes and is established that all of these various processes have plans to them. So we talk about what does your project management plan look like? What components does it need to include, and what level of detail do they need to include? So we talk about preparing and planning to make sure that your project goes right. What if there is a change, within your project management plan, you're going to have that change management plan in there so that you can execute it, and so that your customers or external stakeholders understand that process, and so that they don't have a question when suddenly, you're asking for a change or recommending a change or a change request, and you will have done the analysis on, helping them understand the impacts, to whether it's, the scope, cost, schedule, and quality, right? And so, and then there's, you have your project management plan as an overarching document, but it's made up of subsets of various plans, such as HR, communications, and stakeholder management. And so that class is again on the 16th. And then finally, we wrap up the 4-part series with risk management. This is probably one of my favorite classes because again, I do it so often and throughout my day. So it's identifying, analyzing, and mitigating those project pitfalls, right? So it's making sure that you can, plan on how you're going to identify those risks. How often are you looking out over the horizon? How long how often are you reporting on those risks, and what do you do when a risk becomes an issue? And an issue is just that, a realized risk. And so when when a risk does become an issue, you as a project manager have to do something about it. Hopefully you've done your part of risk management, and so you have a plan put in place to address that issue as it comes up, that you do have mitigation strategy. Any questions on that 4-part series? Again, they're very lightweight. They're very real world based. In the years past, or classes past, we've done birthday parties. We've constructed a building out at the Fauquier campus. We've built a winery. We've done a cross-country trip. And those are just some of the sample projects that we've done and we've taken through that 4-part course. And I'll pause there to see if there's any questions.
Chris, there is one question in the chat. What type of employment options are available to a new project manager? And what are those entry-level positions typically titled or advertised as, i.e. keywords to look for or search for in postings?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. So project managers are needed in all sorts of industries. Oftentimes they're called project coordinators. Any of those coordinating type roles are often project manager based or entry level based project manager type courses or type opportunities. The technology world is in desperate need of project managers, and one of the items that it did not include in this session is by the year I want to say it's 2030, but I believe it's even sooner than that. The project management industry needs there's going to be probably about 8 million. I think it's even more than that, jobs related to project management. So this is a growth industry. As I mentioned, I kind of jokingly talked about or used anecdotally, the NASA and Teslas and the Blue Origins of the world. I mean, those are, if you're into product-based project management, those are areas that are in desperate need. Out here, I've had folks, and I guess I should have addressed that. Some of the students in my class have been substitute teachers, engineers out at Army Corps of Engineers, folks who have worked for Thermo Fisher, folks who have worked, it slips in my mind, but it starts with an H, of course, American Woodmark, Trex. And so it's really a broad range of industries that are seeking project managers. Again, I've spent the majority of my time in what's called public sector, which is the federal government space, as well as Department of Defense. But I have done, early in my career, I worked for a satellite communications company, and our primary focus was Sears, working on a satellite communications solution for them. So it really is quite broad. Frederick County is another area that is looking for project managers, project coordinators, things like that. But yeah, project coordinators, junior project managers is probably the titles or keywords you're looking for. That answered it, hopefully. All right, any others?
And then there's a follow-up question. Is there a need to have a subspecialty like business or IT, or are there opportunities in all industries like tourism, education, etc.?
No, there's no requirement for sub-education or subspecialties. In fact, yeah, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, I've primarily been in the federal space. I've done early in my career, I did satellite communications. I have a business background. I have my MBA, but I've never taken a technical class myself. But I've been involved with again, satellite communications, engineering itself, software development most recently. But again, I couldn't write a line of code. But with experience comes some of that industry knowledge. So if you stay within a particular industry, you're going to naturally pick up some of that. But if you focus on your project management skills, then that's going to take you a long way. If you do become a good project manager, through that experience, then you can take your skills anywhere. Good question.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. Keep them coming. All right, jumping over to the CAPM or PMP CAPM course here. It just, again, this is a more intense course. Again, we're very focused on what's required to pass the exam. I'll be the first to admit my focus is getting you to pass the exam, but it is not, it's making sure that you can come out of the course as a good project manager as well. So I like to think I take the steps above and beyond to make sure that, as you're sitting through the 4-hour-a-week course, that you're understanding the materials, that you're spending time with the materials afterwards, until the next class, and then, taking the practice tests and exams as they pop up. So I'll briefly touch on that. So we chose a provider for the course materials. So they not only provide the hardbound materials, so the paper copies, but as well as they provide online materials that include not only online copies of the materials that are being presented, but they also provide chapter quizzes, pre-tests, chapter tests. So you get a lot of opportunity to spend and test your knowledge in reading in preparation for the PMP or CAPM certification test at the end of the class. Most people take the 9 weeks and then take probably another couple weeks before they, to digest the materials that they've just ingested, and then spend time with it, make sure that they've got it down, and then go off and take the exam itself. As I mentioned, or as documented here, the exam changed back in January of 2021. It's broken down into 3 areas: people, processes, and business environments. You'll see the percentages next to each of those. That's the percentage of questions or percentage of components of the exam that it tests on. So as you see there, the process piece of it's still extremely important, and then that people part is also just as important, right? Because projects take people to execute. So it's making sure that those sitting for the PMP exam understand the soft skills that are required to manage and lead a project team. And then again, we focus on the process piece, the technical piece of the inputs, tools, techniques, and then what leads to the outputs. Those outputs become inputs to other processes within the executing of your projects successfully, and then making sure that you understand the business environment that projects are executed under. And so the old exam used to be 200 questions against 5 process groups identified there: the initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and control, and then closing. There were 49 processes, and then the ITTOs, which are the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. The exam switched to, now it's 180 questions, and it's about 230 minutes, about 4 hours to sit for that exam. And then also, as I mentioned, not only do they test on predictive, or what a lot of us know as waterfall project management, but they also test on the agile and iterative and incremental project management. So you do get a flavor of that. So you do come out of this class understanding, the benefits of both and how to implement, a waterfall type project or an agile type project. And each one has its benefits depending on what you're trying to deliver and how you're trying to deliver it. And so this is, again, a 9-week course. It's very intensive. I call it, there's 3 legs to the stool, so to speak. So there's the component of sitting in the classroom, listening to me talk about and instruct on project management and cover the chapters and slides that are required for the required 35 hours of classroom time. And then another leg of that stool is making sure that you're reading the materials. You can't come into the class expecting that, hey, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to listen to this guy talk, and then I'm going to go off and take the exam. That's not the way the exam's set up, and that's not the way the class and the course is set up. So there is participation and cooperation on your part, having to sit with the materials, read through the materials as well. And then the third part of that stool is testing yourself, right? And sitting with the online materials and making sure that you understand how the questions are going to be asked, the nuances of the way that the questions are asked, and making sure that you are understanding and adjusting the information that's being presented during the course and that you're reading as homework. And jumping over to what the PMP certifications. If you have a bachelor's degree, it's 3 years of project management leadership or management experience. If you have a high school diploma or associate's degree or some sort of equivalent, then it's 5 years of project management experience. And then as well as 35 hours of contact or 35 contact hours, which is that classroom time. That's a requirement whether you have a bachelor's degree or some sort of associate's degree or a high school diploma. And then of course fees to PMI and the test center. And so the testing fee through PMI, if you're a member, is $405. And that is separate outside of this course. And so if you don't quite have that experience, you're looking for an entry, what we call an entry level certification, and they have beefed this up. They being PMI have beefed this up a little bit. High school diploma, it can be the contact hours that you get from this class, which you'll see here for CAPM, you only need about 23 contact hours. Those contact hours, excuse me, or classroom hours count forever. So if you choose that you're only going to sit for the CAPM at this time, which is all well and good, you'll have captured those 35 hours that if you do fall in love with project management, you can go on, get the experience required to sit for that PMP exam, and you will still have captured or accounted for those 35 contact hours through this course. And so I make sure that you're able to pass both of those. Yep.
Sorry to butt in.
That's all right.
So do you help the students actually apply for the tests?
Yes, I will. There's part of the online materials is a sample application, and oftentimes the students will fill out that sample application, send it over to me just to take a look at it, make sure that it makes sense, because there is some lingo and jargon that's not oftentimes understood as it relates to a person's work experience. And so I'll take a look at it and provide some feedback, and then they go off and apply. But yeah, that's definitely something I'm more than willing to do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that just takes us to the questions slide here, Becky. Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of slides here to talk about PMI itself, but I'll pause first to see if we've got any other questions.
I don't have a question per se, but I wanted to just remind everyone that with the 4-part series, it is not required that you take the 4-part series to take the CAPM PMP class. I know we get that question a lot from folks, and I just wanted to make sure everyone understood. I mean, although we do have a lot of students that do that, they like to take the 4-part series, fall in love with project management, usually fall in love with the instructor as well, and want to move on to the PMP and sit for the exam for that as well. So it's not required, but sometimes it does naturally happen. The who for that particular class, sometimes we'll have new project managers that want to take the 4-part series, but sometimes we have folks that already have their certification and want to come back and get their continuing education, their CEUs, in order to keep their license, so their certification. So just wanted to let folks know that those are the types of students that are appropriate for that. And then, like Chris said, when it comes to the PMP and CAPM, typically the students that take that program are serious in sitting for the certification. Although that part of it, the exam, is a separate cost, and it does require students to go to, I believe, is it a Prometric Center or Pearson View?
I think it's Pearson, yeah.
Yep. So, you would have to drive to a Pearson View location, which Northern Virginia is usually the option that most folks take to go and sit for that exam.
Yep. Yeah, and just to tag off of that continuing education, once you do have your PMP certification, it does require 60 PDUs or CEUs every 3 years to maintain your certification. That's one of the reasons it is held in such high regard is, you as a PMP professional, industry understands that you're continuing to keep your skills up to date. Any other questions?
So if we don't have any questions, I do want to let folks know how they can get more information and how they can register. So for more information, you can call LFCC Workforce Solutions at 540-868-7021 or go to our website, www.lfccworkforce.com. I am the program manager for this particular program, and I'll put my contact information in the chat box for you. And if you have questions for our instructor, you can reach out to me and I will forward those questions over to our instructor for you and get you an answer, or he will reach back out to you directly. We do have a coach. Her name is Julia Bridgen, and she was online here with us a few minutes ago. But to reach out to her, I'll also throw her information in the chat box as well. Let me do that really quick and continue to think if anybody has questions.
Yeah, Becky, I was just gonna say, I think we've had a number of folks attend the 4-part series prior to jumping into the PMP certification, which it always amazes me that they want to spend more time with me. It's always fun.
Yeah. Yeah, we have over the years had several folks take that and then hop right over. So
Yep.
That's very good news. Forgot my video wasn't on. All right, Ramona, Michelle, anything last minute before we close off for today?
No, nothing else from me.
All right. All right, well, thank you very much, Chris. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we close out?
I think we've covered it. If not, like you said, just don't hesitate to reach out. And I think we're good to go. We're a go for the 19th, right?
I believe so. I think so far we've got about 3 students. So I'm sure those numbers will climb. Usually right before the class starts, we get a lot more registration. So get registered early, fast, so that we can get started next week.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.